Natalie Princeton, a radiant heiress, and Dominic Hayes, a powerful millionaire CEO, entered an arranged marriage 5 years ago to secure their family's business empires. But after 3 years of a cold, passionless union, they divorced. What neither ever confessed was that pride and silence had buried their true feelings. Now, after 2 years away, Natalie returns to Chicago, and when Dominic spots her with another wealthy suitor at a glittering event, jealousy ignites what was never truly extinguished. Welcome to our channel. Before we dive in, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, telling us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts and keep the conversation going. Also share this video to your friends and loved ones, and turn on post notifications so you don't miss future videos from us. Thank you as you do so. Sit back and relax as we dive into the story. The diamond necklace felt cold against Natalie Princeton's skin, a familiar weight she'd thought she'd forgotten. It was a princely sum of compressed carbon and impeccable craftsmanship, designed to dazzle under the crystal chandeliers of the Chicago Metropolitan Art Institute. It did its job brilliantly. So did she. She offered a polished smile to a passing socialite, her fingers lightly brushing the stem of her champagne flute. 2 years. 2 years since she'd last breathed this rarefied air, thick with the scent of expensive perfume and old money. It still smelled the same. It was she who was different. "You're the most captivating woman in the room, you know," a smooth voice murmured at her elbow. Lucas Thorne, her date for the evening, looked at her with open admiration. He was handsome, successful in his own right in venture capital, and, most importantly, uncomplicated. He represented a future she was meticulously building for herself, one far removed from the gilded cage of her past. "You're biased, Lucas," she said, her smile feeling more genuine now. "Not at all. It's a simple observation of fact." His hand rested on the small of her back, a gesture that was meant to be possessive, comforting. Instead, it made her spine stiffen ever so slightly. It was a feeling she knew all too well, the subtle pressure of being someone's accessory. Her gaze drifted across the ballroom, over the sea of tuxedos and silk, and for a moment she was back there. 5 years ago. Standing right here at this very gala, her hand tucked into the crook of Dominic Hayes's arm. Their engagement announcement. The flashbulbs had been blinding. He'd looked like a storybook prince carved from marble, flawless, powerful, and utterly impassive. Her smile that night had been just as practiced as the one she wore now. Their marriage had been the business deal of the decade, the elegant merger of the Princeton legacy with the Hayes empire. For 3 years they had played their parts to perfection. They'd hosted impeccable dinners in their sterile penthouse, attended endless functions, and presented a united, devastatingly beautiful front to the world. And in the echoing silence of their home, they'd lived separate lives, 2 satellites orbiting a cold, empty star. Pride was the language they spoke best. She'd wanted a sign, any sign that he saw her, not just the Princeton heiress. He'd offered none, and her own stubbornness had sealed their fate. The divorce had been as quiet and efficient as their union. A sudden shift in the energy of the room pulled her from the memory. A subtle hush fell over a section of the crowd near the entrance, a ripple of attention moving like a wave. Natalie didn't need to look to know who had arrived. Her body knew before her mind did, a traitorous current of awareness shooting through her. And then she saw him. Dominic Hayes. He stood framed in the arched doorway, looking as if he'd just stepped off the cover of a financial magazine. His tuxedo was impeccably tailored, emphasizing his broad shoulders and powerful build. His hair, that same shade of wheat gold, was swept back from a face that was all sharp, commanding angles. His eyes, a piercing ice blue, scanned the room with a CEO's calculated assessment. Natalie's breath hitched. 2 years had done nothing to diminish his impact. If anything, the time apart had sharpened the edges of his presence, made him more potent, more undeniable. She forced herself to look away, to focus on Lucas's anecdote about a recent merger. She laughed at the right moment, tilting her head, letting the light catch the diamonds in her ears. She would not let him see her unsettled. She was Natalie Princeton again, not Natalie Hayes. The distinction was everything. Dominic's gaze swept over the crowd, a king surveying his domain. It was a practiced routine. Acknowledge the mayor, nod to the board chairman, offer a tight smile to a rival he was currently undermining. And then his eyes, cold and dismissive, landed on her. The ice in them flickered. His scan had been automatic, but his return to her was not. It was a physical jolt. His shoulders straightened almost imperceptibly. His expression, usually a mask of cool indifference, tightened. His eyes narrowed, taking her in, the dark, radiant skin against the crimson silk of her gown, the confident set of her shoulders, the easy smile she offered the man beside her. And then his gaze dropped to Lucas's hand on her back. A muscle in Dominic's jaw clenched. It was a tiny, almost invisible movement, but Natalie saw it. She knew that tick. It was the only tell he'd ever had, the sole indicator of a storm brewing behind that placid facade. It was the look he'd get right before he eviscerated a competitor in a boardroom. Jealousy. Raw, primal, and utterly unexpected. It wasn't the cold, dismissive look she had prepared for. This was heat. This was fire. This was the very thing that had been conspicuously, painfully absent from their entire marriage. Lucas, sensing her distraction, followed her gaze. Ah, the infamous ex-husband. He's staring. Let him, Natalie said, her voice surprisingly steady. She took a sip of champagne, the bubbles sharp on her tongue. She would not crumble. Not now. Not ever again. But as she met Dominic's stare across the glittering room, a silent challenge passing between them, she felt the carefully reconstructed walls around her heart tremble. Because the look in his eyes wasn't one of polite recognition or even disdain. It was one of possession. And it ignited something deep within her, a flame she had spent 2 long years convincing herself had been extinguished forever. The air crackled, and for the first time since she'd left, the past didn't feel so past. The air in the grand ballroom, once merely stifling, now felt charged, as if a thunderstorm had brewed inside the crystal chandeliers. Natalie kept her smile fixed, a flawless mask for the riot unfolding within her. She could feel the heat of Dominic's stare like a physical brand between her shoulder blades. Lucas's hand on her back, once a neutral weight, now felt like a claim being contested. He's still looking, Lucas murmured, a hint of amusement in his voice. He clearly saw it as a point of pride, a testament to the prize on his arm. Ignore him, Natalie said, her tone lighter than she felt. Dominic Hayes believes everything in this room is his to scrutinize. She guided Lucas toward a group of art patrons, using their bodies as a shield. She spoke of Rothko and fundraising goals, her words automatic, her mind entirely elsewhere. She was a master of this performance. She had done it for years. But the script had changed, and her co-star had just stormed onto the stage uninvited. She lasted 10 more minutes before the need for a reprieve became overwhelming. "Will you excuse me?" she said to Lucas, touching his arm. "I need some air." The terrace was blessedly cool and half-empty. Natalie leaned against the cold stone balustrade, gripping it tightly as she looked out over the glittering skyline of Chicago, the city they had once ostensibly ruled together. She took a deep breath, the night air clearing the champagne-induced fog from her head. This was a minor setback, she told herself. A ghost from a past life rattling his chains. Meant nothing. The scent of his cologne reached her first. A clean, sharp, expensive scent that was uniquely his. It had haunted her closet for months after she'd left. Her body went rigid. "Natalie." His voice was deeper than she remembered, a low rumble that vibrated right through her core. She didn't turn, not immediately. She needed a second to compose her features, to reassemble the armor he had so easily fractured with a single look. Slowly she turned to face him. Up close, the 2 years were both kind and cruel. There were new lines at the corners of his eyes, a slight weathering that only made him look more formidable, more real. But the eyes themselves were the same, glacial blue, impossibly penetrating, and now burning with an intensity that stole the air from her lungs. "Dominic," she acknowledged, her voice a study in cool neutrality. "I heard you were in Tokyo." The flight back was expedited. His gaze swept over her, a quick, brutal assessment that missed nothing. The defiant set of her chin, the nervous flutter at her throat, the way her hands still gripped the stone behind her. "You're back. Astute as ever. Indefinitely? That's the plan." She crossed her arms, a defensive gesture she immediately regretted. It made her look affected. Chicago has its charms. And its opportunities. His lip curled just slightly. "Ah yes. Your escort." Another venture capitalist looking to leverage a name for a leg up. The insult, so typically Dominic, was a splash of cold water. It steadied her. Lucas is a friend. And he built his firm from the ground up. He doesn't need to leverage anyone's name. The barb, a direct reference to their own arranged union, hit its mark. His eyes narrowed. A friend who looks at you like you're his next acquisition. And how exactly did you look at me, Dominic? The question was out before she could stop it, sharp and laden with a history she'd promised herself she wouldn't revisit. For a fleeting second, something raw flashed in his eyes. Not anger. Something else. Something that looked almost like pain. It was gone so fast she doubted she'd seen it at all. I looked at you as my wife, he said, his voice dropping, becoming dangerously quiet. Ex-wife. A technicality you seem eager to make us both forget with your very public display. She let out a short, incredulous laugh. My display? You're the one who stalked across the entire ballroom to confront me. What do you want, Dominic? Did I violate some clause in the divorce papers? The former Mrs. Hayes shall not attend galas with handsome men? He took a step closer, invading her space. The night air suddenly felt thick, hard to breathe. Why are you back, Natalie? Truly. I told you. Opportunities. You have a trust fund that could fund a small nation. You never wanted opportunities. You wanted... He trailed off as if realizing the minefield he was stepping into. What did I want, Dominic? She pressed, her heart hammering against her ribs. Enlighten me. Since you apparently knew me so well. He was close enough now that she could see the flecks of silver in his blue eyes, could feel the heat radiating from his body. The air crackled with the words they had never said, the accusations, the apologies, the desperate, hungry things they had both swallowed down for the sake of pride. You wanted a fairy tale, he said, his voice barely a whisper. It wasn't a dismissal. It sounded strangely like an admission. And you wanted a business merger, she fired back, her own voice trembling. You got what you wanted. For 3 years. Now it's my turn. She saw the words land, saw the way his jaw tightened again, the muscle twitching furiously. He looked like he wanted to say something else, something entirely different. But the habit of a lifetime was too strong. The walls slammed back down. Congratulations, he said, the word icy and formal. He took a deliberate step back, re-establishing a cold, professional distance that felt more intimate than his proximity had. I hope your new venture is everything you hoped for. He gave her one last scorching look that seemed to say this wasn't over, turned on his heel, and walked back into the ballroom, leaving her alone on the terrace. Natalie sucked in a ragged breath, her composure shattered. She stared at the space where he'd been, the ghost of his presence and his cologne still clinging to the air. The encounter had been a battle, and she had no idea who had won. All she knew was that the carefully constructed piece she'd built over 2 years had just been obliterated by a 5-minute conversation with the one man who could see right through her. The silence of Natalie's new penthouse was a stark contrast to the roaring in her ears. She dropped her clutch on a minimalist console table, the sound unnaturally loud in the spacious, empty room. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking, glittering panorama of the city Dominic Hayes still seemed to own. She walked to the window, not to admire the view, but to ensure she couldn't see the lights of the Hayes Tower from this angle. She could still smell his cologne. With a frustrated sigh, she shrugged out of the crimson gown, letting it pool on the pristine white floor like a bloodstain. The diamond necklace felt like a collar. She unclasped it with fumbling fingers, laying it carefully in its velvet box. A relic from a conquered life. 2 years. 2 years of therapy, of building her own identity, of learning to breathe without the weight of the Hayes name pressing down on her. And it had taken him 5 minutes to make her feel like that same lonely, invisible wife, desperate for a scrap of his attention. You wanted a fairy tale. His words echoed in the silence, laced with a new, unsettling tone. It hadn't sounded like the mockery she'd expected. It had sounded regretful? No, she said aloud, her voice firm in the empty apartment. She would not romanticize the past. He had gotten what he wanted, a profitable alliance and a clean, quiet divorce when the arrangement had served its purpose. Her return was an anomaly in his spreadsheets, a variable he hadn't accounted for. His jealousy was nothing more than primal possessiveness, the irritation of a man seeing a former asset in someone else's portfolio. She was a venture, not a vestige. She repeated the mantra as she got ready for bed, but sleep was a distant country. Across the city, in a penthouse that was all sharp angles, cold marble and floor-to-ceiling glass, Dominic Hayes poured 2 fingers of amber whiskey but didn't drink it. He stood at his window, his own view a commanding sweep of the city he had in many ways indeed conquered. But the victory felt hollow tonight. The image of Natalie was burned onto his retina. Not the Natalie of the past few years, the politely distant wife, a beautiful, cold companion in a gilded cage, but the woman on the terrace. Vibrant, defiant, alive. Her eyes had flashed with a fire he realized with a sickening jolt he had never truly seen before. Or perhaps he had simply never bothered to look. He had spent 3 years married to a phantom, and 2 years regretting the loss of her. The irony was a bitter pill. He thought of the man's hand on her back. Lucas Thorne. He'd had his assistant send a dossier on the man within an hour of leaving the gala. Competent. Ambitious. Clever. The profile made Dominic's grip tighten on the glass. Thorne was the kind of man who would appreciate Natalie, not as a trophy but as a partner. The thought was intolerable. He had told himself his rushed return from Tokyo was about a potential merger with the Laurent Group, a French luxury conglomerate looking to expand its North American footprint. It was the biggest deal of the year, the kind of complex, high-stakes acquisition that usually consumed him entirely. But as he scrolled through the Laurent file on his tablet, he couldn't focus on the numbers. His mind kept returning to the terrace, to the wounded pride in her eyes when he'd mentioned her escort. He'd wanted to get a rise out of her, to shatter that infuriatingly perfect composure. He'd succeeded. And in doing so, he'd only managed to make himself look like the same arrogant bastard he'd always been. A notification chimed on his phone, a reminder from his assistant, Evelyn. Lunch with Ms. Laurent. No. The Ivory Room. He was about to dismiss it when a second email popped up, this one from the head of the Princeton Family Foundation. It was a polite, rambling update on their annual charity wing of the upcoming Chicago Arts Gala, an event his company had co-sponsored for a decade. 2 separate worlds. Business and philanthropy. And then, a connection sparked, so obvious and brutal it was almost divine intervention. The Princeton Foundation was a cornerstone of Chicago high society. Impeccable reputation, deep ties to the city's old money. The Laurent Group, seeking to establish its brand with elegance and legacy, not just wealth, would be desperate for their endorsement. And who had just been named the new head of major gifts and development for the Princeton Foundation. His assistant's earlier briefing on Natalie's activities flashed in his mind. It wasn't just a new venture, it was a strategic move into a position of real influence. Is Dominic picked up his phone, his mind racing, a new plan crystallizing with ruthless efficiency. This wasn't about jealousy. This was about business. A convenient, logical alignment of interests. He called Evelyn. Her Mr. Hayes was crisp, expecting a pre-lunch briefing. Evelyn, cancel my lunch at the Ivory Room. Sir? Ms. Lauren's team has already reschedule it for a dinner and make a reservation for 3. Pause. 3, sir? Yes. Myself, Ms. Laurent, and ensure Natalie Princeton is invited. The silence on the other end of the line was profound. Evelyn had been his assistant through the marriage and the divorce. She knew the unspoken rules of the post-Natalie era. Miss Princeton? May I ask on what pretext? The pretext, Dominic said, his voice dropping into the cool, commanding tone that brooked no argument, is the Laurent merger. The Princeton Foundation's support could be a decisive factor. It's a logical strategic discussion. It was logical. It was also a lie so transparent it was almost an insult. He was forcing her hand. Using business, the only language they had ever truly spoken, to corner her. To get her back in a room with him. This time on his terms. He ended the call and finally took a sip of the whiskey, the burn down his throat a satisfying punishment. He was playing a dangerous game, leveraging the very thing that had driven them apart to pull her back in. But as he looked out at his city, he knew he had no choice. He had seen the way Thorne looked at her. He had seen the future she was building without him. And Dominic Hayes had never, in his entire life, walked away from something he wanted. And he wanted Natalie back. The email from Dominic's assistant, Evelyn, had been a masterpiece of corporate politeness, outlining a mutually beneficial discussion regarding the Laurent Group's desire to align with the Princeton Foundation's esteemed legacy. Natalie had almost deleted it. The audacity of the man, using business to orchestrate a meeting mere days after their Terrace confrontation. But the professional in her, the part that had fought for this new role, had overruled the furious ex-wife. The Laurent deal was monumental. If her foundation could secure a partnership, it would mean millions for their initiatives. Letting personal history sabotage that was a luxury she couldn't afford. So she'd accepted. The dinner had been a special kind of torture. Séverine Laurent, a chic Parisian woman in her 50s, had been charm itself, her eyes flicking with keen interest between Dominic's imposing presence and Natalie's polished replies. Dominic had played his part flawlessly, the visionary CEO, the devoted philanthropist. He deferred to Natalie's expertise, praised the foundation's work, and somehow, his fingers had brushed against hers twice when passing the salt cellar. Each time, a jolt of unwanted electricity had shot up her arm. Now, Natalie stood in the echoing half-constructed space that would soon be her new office at the foundation headquarters. Drop cloths covered elegant furniture, and the scent of fresh paint and sawdust hung in the air. Boxes of donor files were stacked against one wall. It was here that Séverine Laurent, on her way to a late flight, had asked to see the plans for the proposed joint gala. "The flow is essential, you understand?" Séverine had said, gesturing with a perfectly manicured hand. "The movement from reception to auction to dinner. It must feel effortless." Natalie, who had been up since 5 a.m. finalizing the layouts, had pulled out the large architectural blueprints and spread them across a makeshift table of 2 sawhorses and a plywood sheet. Dominic had lingered, a silent, brooding presence by the door. And then the storm had hit. Not a metaphorical one. A real, summer thunderstorm that exploded over Chicago with little warning. Rain lashed against the high windows, and a tremendous crack of thunder shook the building. A second later, the lights flickered, buzzed, and died, plunging them into utter blackness. Natalie gasped. The sudden silence after the storm's roar was deafening. "Well," Séverine Laurent's voice came from the darkness, laced with amusement. "It seems Chicago is eager to make an impression." A moment later, the emergency lights flickered on, casting a weak, orange glow that created long, dancing shadows across the room. "The power must be out for the block." Dominic's voice was calm, close beside her. He had his phone out, the screen illuminating the sharp planes of his face. "My driver is stuck in the flood. The streets are gridlocked." He looked at Séverine. "It seems you'll miss your flight." Séverine sighed dramatically. "My hotel then? Perhaps I can wait there?" Another check of his phone. "The Intercontinental is without power as well. The storm is comprehensive." He finally looked at Natalie, his eyes glinting in the dim light. "It appears we're stranded." The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. Stranded. Together. An hour later, Séverine was bundled into a miraculously procured cab with a promise from the hotel manager, a friend of Dominic's, of a generator-powered suite. The cab's tail lights disappeared into the sheets of rain, leaving Natalie and Dominic standing in the lobby of the dark, empty building. "My driver is still 40 minutes out." "At least," Dominic said, his voice echoing in the marble-lined space. "I'll call a car," Natalie said, pulling out her phone. No service. The storm had taken out the local towers. She looked at him in dismay. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. "It seems we wait." They retreated back to her office, the only space with any semblance of furniture. The emergency lights created a pool of intimacy in the vast, dark room. Natalie felt hyper-aware of him, of the sound of his breathing, the shift of his weight, the sheer size of him in the confined space between the boxes and blueprints. "You've done impressive work here," he said, gesturing to the plans still spread on the table. "This vision, it's all you." The unexpected praise, so specific and genuine, disarmed her. "Thank you. I always knew you were capable of it," he continued, his voice low. He wasn't looking at the plans anymore. He was looking at her. "I was just too much of a fool to ever tell you." The air left her lungs. This wasn't the script. This was off-book, dangerous territory. "Dominic? Why did you leave, Natalie?" The question was blunt, stripped of all its usual arrogance. It was just a man asking a woman a question that had haunted him for 2 years. Was it just the arrangement? The coldness? Or was it me? The raw vulnerability in his voice was her undoing. All her defenses, carefully reconstructed, crumbled to dust. "It was the silence," she whispered, her own voice breaking. She wrapped her arms around herself, staring at the blueprints she could no longer see. It was eating dinner every night with a stranger. It was hearing you praise a business rival's insight and never once asking for my opinion. It was going to bed every night feeling alone while lying next to you. She dared to look at him then. The orange emergency light carved out his expression, and what she saw there wasn't anger or dismissal. It was a profound, gut-wrenching regret. I thought that was what you wanted, he said, taking a step closer. The space between them crackled. Distance. A transaction. My father, he told me you understood the terms. That you preferred it that way. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. Your father? He said you'd agreed it was best to keep emotions out of it. That it was cleaner. He let out a harsh, self-deprecating laugh. And I, the master negotiator, I never once thought to confirm the terms with the other party. I was too proud to ask. Too afraid you'd confirm it. The truth, buried for years under layers of pride and miscommunication, finally lay bare between them. It wasn't indifference. It was a tragic, stupid error. A lie told by a man terrified of losing control to a son who was too arrogant to see past it. They stood there in the semi-darkness, the past rewriting itself with every ragged breath. I hated you, Natalie breathed, the words no longer an accusation but a confession. I hated you for not seeing me. I see you now, Natalie, he said, his voice rough with emotion. He closed the final distance between them. He didn't touch her. He just looked down at her, his gaze burning with an intensity that the darkness could not hide. God help me, I see you now. And then his hand was cupping her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin. It was the first tender touch he had ever given her. It shattered her completely. She surged forward, closing the infinitesimal gap, and crushed her mouth to his. It was not a gentle kiss. It was 5 years of pent-up longing, 3 years of lonely desperation, and 2 years of angry regret unleashed. It was a collision. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her flush against him, one hand tangling in her hair, the other splayed against the small of her back, pressing her into him. She met his hunger with her own, her fingers digging into the hard muscles of his shoulders, kissing him back with a ferocity she never knew she possessed. The storm raged outside, but inside, a different tempest had broken loose. It was passion, raw and real and undeniable, finally igniting what pride and silence had kept buried for far too long. The kiss was an earthquake. It shattered the foundations of the past 5 years, crumbling the walls of pride and miscommunication into dust. It was not a gentle exploration but a desperate, hungry claiming, a conversation they should have started a lifetime ago. Natalie's hands were fisted in the lapels of his impossibly expensive suit, holding on as the world tilted off its axis. Dominic's arms were a steel band around her, one hand cradling the back of her head as if she were something precious, the other pulling her hips flush against his, erasing any last vestige of space between them. When they finally broke apart, gasping for air, their foreheads rested together. The only sound was their ragged breathing and the relentless drum of rain against the windows. The weak emergency lights painted his face in shades of gold and shadow, his eyes dark pools of stunned awe. Natalie, he breathed, her name a prayer, a curse, a revelation on his lips. Reality, cold and sharp, began to seep back in. What had she done? She had kissed Dominic Hayes. She had poured 5 years of bottled-up emotion into the man who was the architect of her deepest loneliness. The sheer, terrifying vulnerability of it made her push against his chest, taking a stumbling step back. Her fingers flew to her lips, which felt bruised and sensitized, forever marked by him. He let her go, but his gaze held her captive. He looked as wrecked as she felt. His usually impeccable hair was disheveled from her fingers, his lips were swollen, and his eyes held a wild, dazed light she had never seen before. That shouldn't have happened, she whispered, her voice trembling. Why? The single word was raw, stripped bare of all pretense. Because it changes everything. And it changes nothing. The words tumbled out, fueled by a surge of panic. We can't just kiss away 5 years, Dominic. We can't kiss away the fact that you believed your father over me. That you never trusted me enough to just ask what I wanted. He didn't try to defend himself. He just stood there taking the blows, his eyes never leaving her face. I know, he said, his voice low and gravelly. It was the greatest failure of my life. Not the divorce. The silence that led to it. His admission disarmed her fury, leaving behind a raw, aching hurt. She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling exposed. I spent 3 years trying to be the perfect wife for you. The perfect accessory. I thought if I was poised enough, elegant enough, quiet enough, you'd finally see me. But you never did. I saw you, he interrupted, taking a step toward her. He stopped when she flinched. God, Natalie, I saw you every single day. You were a vision. You were this radiant, intelligent, utterly captivating woman in my house, and I was terrified. The confession was so absurd, so utterly unexpected that she could only stare. Terrified? Of what? Of you, he ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of utter frustration. Of what you made me feel. It was messy and complicated and huge. It wasn't in the business plan. My entire life had been about control. About building an empire to prove I was nothing like my father, a man who let emotions ruin him. And then there you were, and with one smile, you could undo a decade of my self-control. So I built a wall. I hid behind the arrangement. It was safer. The truth of it, the profound, stupid human insecurity behind his cold facade, was like a key turning in a long-locked door. She saw it all then. Not a powerful CEO, but a boy who had built a fortress around his heart and then panicked when someone found a way inside. I thought you were cold, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I thought I repulsed you. A pained sound escaped him. He closed the distance between them, but this time he didn't touch her. He just looked down at her, his expression agonized. You consumed me. Every damn day. I'd leave meetings early hoping to catch you in the garden. I'd invent reasons to be near your office. I memorized the sound of your laugh from down the hall. It was the only thing that felt real in that entire mausoleum we lived in. Tears she had refused to shed for years finally welled in her eyes. Why didn't you ever say anything? Pride, he said, the word simple and devastating. And fear. The two things I'm apparently an expert in. He finally reached out, his thumb gently catching a tear as it traced down her cheek. The touch was so tender it made her breath catch. I am so sorry, Natalie. For all of it. For every second I made you feel unseen. For every time I chose my own ego over the woman who was the best thing that ever happened to me. The apology was everything she had ever wanted to hear. It was the balm on a wound she thought would never heal. But it also opened up a chasm of terrifying possibility. She looked up at him, her vision blurred by tears. What are we supposed to do with this? With now? He cupped her face in both his hands, his touch impossibly gentle. We could start over. It's not that simple. It can be. He leaned down, pressing his forehead to hers again, his eyes closed. We have all the facts now. No more fathers. No more lies. Just you and me. We can be terrified together this time. Outside, the rain began to lessen. The violent storm was passing, leaving a battered, cleansed city in its wake. Inside, the emergency lights hummed, casting their intimate glow. Natalie looked at the man before her. Not the powerful CEO, not the cold stranger she'd been married to, but just Dominic. Flawed, vulnerable, and finally seeing her. She didn't know what came next. It was terrifying. But for the first time, the fear was laced with something else. Something that felt an awful lot like hope. She took a shaky breath and nodded just once. Okay, she whispered. It wasn't a promise of forever. It was just a start. But for now, in the quiet aftermath of the storm, it was enough. The hum of the emergency lights was the only sound in the office for a long moment, a steady drone underscoring the seismic shift that had just occurred. Okay. The word hung between them, fragile and immense. Was a truce. A beginning. A terrifying leap into the unknown. Dominic's hands were still cradling her face, his thumbs making slow, gentle strokes against her skin. The gesture was so unlike him, so devoid of the calculated precision that usually defined him, that it made Natalie's heart ache. He looked at her as if she were a miracle he'd almost broken. Your driver, she finally said, her voice husky. He'll be here soon. The spell fractured but didn't break. Reality was reasserting itself, but it was a new reality, its edges softened by the truths they'd finally spoken. Yes, Dominic murmured, reluctantly dropping his hands. The loss of his warmth was immediate. He pulled out his phone, the screen illuminating his face. The roads are clearing. He's 5 minutes out. 5 minutes. The countdown to a decision. What happened when they left this dark, intimate bubble? Would the old patterns re-emerge? Would pride once again silence them? Natalie moved to the window, looking out at the glistening city. The storm had washed everything clean. I meant what I said, Dominic. It can't be like before. I won't be a secret. I won't be a part of your life you compartmentalize. You were never a secret, Natalie, he said, coming to stand behind her. He didn't touch her, but she could feel the heat of him, a solid presence at her back. You were the center of it. I was just too much of a coward to admit it. She turned to face him. And Lucas. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he didn't look away. That's your choice. Not mine. I have no right to claim you. All I have is the hope that you'll give me a chance to earn you. It was the right answer. The only answer that showed he truly heard her. He wasn't demanding, he was asking. The humility in it was more potent than any grand declaration. Down on the street, the familiar black town car with its discreet license plate pulled to the curb. That's me, he said softly. He didn't move. Neither did she. The moment stretched, charged with all the things left unsaid, all the promises hovering in the air between them. I have the Loron contract review tomorrow at my office, he said, his voice carefully neutral, though his eyes were anything but. Your insight on the philanthropic annex would be invaluable. We could discuss it over dinner. A working dinner. A smile touched her lips. A working dinner? Is that what we're calling it now? A ghost of his old arrogant smile flickered across his face. It's a start. He reached out, his fingers gently brushing a stray curl from her forehead before his hand dropped away. The simple contact sent a fresh shiver through her. Good night, Natalie. Good night, Dominic. He turned and walked out of the office, his footsteps echoing in the empty hall. Natalie listened until she heard the faint ding of the elevator, then the distant sound of the lobby door closing. She was alone again, but the silence felt different. It was full of his confession, full of the memory of his kiss, full of possibility. The next day was a whirlwind. Natalie dove into her work, but her focus was fractured. Every email notification made her heart jump. Every call she took, she half expected to hear his voice. Lucas called in the afternoon. I missed you last night. The storm was something else. Dinner tonight? I found this new place in the West Loop. Natalie's grip tightened on her phone. She looked out her new office window. The sun was shining, the city gleaming after its wash. The path of least resistance was right there. Lucas was safe. He was uncomplicated. He represented a future that made sense. But it was a future built on a foundation that felt like sand after last night. Lucas, I can't tonight, she said, choosing her words carefully. Something's come up. Pause. Something? Or someone? His tone was light, but there was an edge to it. The society pages had likely already buzzed with photos of her and Dominic at the gala, then of them deep in conversation with Séverine Laurent. It's complicated, she admitted. It usually is with ex-husbands, he said, a note of finality in his voice. He was a smart man. He could read the writing on the wall. Natalie, you're a remarkable woman. Don't get tangled back up in something that hurt you. I know, she whispered. Thank you, Lucas. For everything. After she hung up, she felt a pang of guilt, but beneath it was a surge of certainty. She had chosen. She had chosen the complicated, terrifying, passionate path. She had chosen Dominic. The text came an hour later. Not from his assistant. From him. Dominic, dinner. 8 p.m. My place. I'll cook. The message was so utterly domestic, so unlike the five-star restaurant reservations of their past, that a laugh bubbled out of her. He was trying. Really trying. Natalie, you cook? Dominic, I have many hidden talents. I hope to show you all of them. Heat flushed through her. This was it. No turning back. She arrived at his penthouse at 5 minutes to 8, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He opened the door himself, dressed not in a suit, but in dark jeans and a simple gray sweater that made his eyes seem even bluer. He looked approachable. Real. The aroma of garlic, herbs, and searing steak filled the air. You really are cooking, she said, stepping inside. I told you I had talents, he said, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his face. He took her coat, his fingers brushing against her neck, and for a moment they just stood in the foyer looking at each other. The penthouse was different. Warmer. The cold, minimalist art was gone, replaced with richer colors. A book was left open on the sofa. It felt like a home, not a showpiece. "I've made some changes," he said, following her gaze. "It needed to feel different. For me." He led her to the kitchen where a meal was indeed in progress. It was a little messy, wonderfully chaotic, and entirely perfect. Over dinner, a surprisingly delicious steak au poivre, they talked. Really talked. Not about business, but about books, about a documentary she'd seen, about his disastrous first attempt at making the peppercorn sauce. They laughed. The sound of it, echoing through his penthouse, felt like a revolution. Later, he poured her a glass of wine and led her to the terrace. The city sparkled below them, the same view they had shared a lifetime ago. But everything was different. He stood behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her back against his chest. He nuzzled her hair, his breath warm against her ear. "I'm all in, Natalie," he whispered, his voice vibrating through her. "No walls. No pride. Just me. It's terrifying. And it's the only thing that makes sense." She leaned back into his solid strength, into the promise in his words. She thought of the cold heiress, the lonely CO, the years of silence. She thought of the kiss in the dark, the confession in the storm. She turned in his arms, looking up at the man who was finally truly hers. "I'm all in too." The following months were a revelation. A beautiful, chaotic, breathtaking education in the man Dominic Hayes truly was, stripped of the armor he'd worn for a lifetime. Gone was the cold CEO who scheduled his life in 15-minute increments. In his place was a man who sent her ridiculous memes in the middle of the day, who got flour all over his kitchen, and her, attempting to bake her birthday cake from scratch because the store-bought ones never taste as good. He was the man who listened, truly listened, to her ideas for the foundation, his eyes alight with genuine interest and pride. They traveled to Paris to finalize the Laurent deal, but the trip became their own. They walked hand in hand along the Seine, stole kisses in the shadow of the Eiffel Tower, and spent a rainy afternoon tangled in the sheets of their hotel room, whispering secrets they'd never dared to share before. It wasn't perfect. Old habits died hard. There were moments when he would retreat into a silent intensity, and she would feel a flicker of the old fear. But now she would simply place a hand on his arm and say, "Talk to me." And he would. He would tell her about a pressure at work, a memory of his father, a fear of failing her. Vulnerability, they learned, was a muscle that grew stronger with use. One crisp autumn evening, 5 months after the night of the storm, Dominic led her up to the penthouse terrace. The Chicago skyline was a tapestry of glittering lights against a velvet sky. A small table was set for two, candles flickering in the gentle breeze. "What's all this?" Natalie asked, smiling. "The Laurent deal was sealed weeks ago. Did I forget an anniversary?" "No anniversary," he said, pulling out her chair. His hand rested on her shoulder for a moment, a warm, steadying weight. Just a celebration. They ate and talked, the easy, comfortable rhythm of their new life flowing between them. But Natalie sensed a nervous energy in him, a slight tremor in his hand when he poured the wine. When the dessert plates were cleared, he didn't call for the check. Instead, he got down on one knee beside her chair. Natalie's breath caught. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild, joyful drumbeat. He took her hands in his ice-blue eyes holding hers with an intensity that was now familiar, but no less potent. "Natalie," he began, his voice thick with emotion. 5 years ago I gave you a ring and a contract. I offered you a business arrangement and called it a marriage. I was the biggest fool who ever lived." A tear traced a path down her cheek. He squeezed her hands. "These last few months, you have given me a life I never knew was possible. You've shown me that love isn't a weakness, it's the only strength that matters." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He didn't open it yet. "This time I'm not offering you a merger. I'm not offering you a deal. I'm offering you my heart. All of it. Forever." He opened the box. Nestled inside wasn't the cold, perfect diamond of their first engagement. It was a unique, stunning Art Deco ring, with a central emerald-cut diamond flanked by intricate sapphire baguettes. It was timeless, bold, and utterly her. "Natalie Princeton," he said, his voice clear and sure under the vast night sky. "Will you do me the extraordinary honor of marrying me? For real this time?" She was crying freely now, tears of joy washing away the last lingering ghosts of the past. She looked at the man she had once hated, the man she had never stopped loving, and saw her future. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking on the word. She pulled him up to her, framing his face with her hands. Yes, Dominic. 1,000 times yes. He slid the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, and then he kissed her, a kiss that tasted of promise and forever. When they finally broke apart, foreheads resting together, they were both laughing and crying. Below them, the city they had once ruled together in lonely silence continued to sparkle. But now, high above it all, they were no longer a prince and princess in a gilded cage. They were simply Dominic and Natalie, two flawed, grateful people who had finally found their way home in each other's arms. Their foundation was no longer business or bloodlines, but something far stronger and far more enduring. A love built on truth, forged in fire and chosen every single day. If this story touched your heart, remember, sometimes the smallest steps lead to the biggest changes. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe and join us for more stories that prove compassion can change the world.